I do want to recognize that we are recording this and we share it with the Heritage area community for those who aren't able to join us at this moment. So, by remaining on the call, you're acknowledging that you're okay with being part of a recorded session. This is a special session today. We're joined by colleagues, Park Service colleagues in the Southeast region to discuss interpreting race and social justice. They are, Christina and Stephanie can share more about how this was developed and how this is being used in the Southeast region. Some of our Heritage area colleagues in the Southeast have been involved in this already. So take it away, Christina and Stephanie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katie. Thanks for hosting us. And I'm really excited to share this work about our regional race and social justice work effort that's been an employee-driven initiative, just because it was so timely and there was so much energy around it. So back in summer 2020, after George Floyd, I checked in with my team just to see how everybody was doing when there was all this national turmoil going on. And they said, well, don't just check in with us. We need to check in with the field and see what people are experiencing, because as interpreters, we're in the business of interpreting the intangible meanings associated with things, and those intangible meanings associated with so many things that are relevant to the stories we interpret: civil war, civil rights, all these stories that are still playing out in the Southeast. Those meanings are changing quickly. The public are charged and people are out on the front line, and we don't know what they're experiencing. And so I didn't just want to talk to people and figure out or push a training on people, but I wanted to really know what people were experiencing and what the need was. And so I will give you guys a little bit of background about the group and what we've done, because we actually have a strategic plan with these 4 different focus areas. And then we'll talk about ways that the partner groups and heritage areas can collaborate and use some of the resources that we created. So we had guiding principles to, am I on the right slide? Sorry, I just got surprised. It's because so many screens are going on. I think I am ahead of myself on the slides. Give me 1 second. Oh yeah, okay. I wanted to be here. So yeah, there were 40 different interpreters who volunteered to be part of the initiative, and it ranged from frontline interpreters to interpretive managers, even superintendents. And we also had people representing really different kinds of parks: Civil War parks, Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site, a park that pretty much entirely interprets nature. So it was a nice, diverse mix. And we wanted to have discussions in a way that people felt safe to tell me what they were really going through and what they really needed in order to establish a strategic framework. So we set up some guiding principles for our safe spaces. And this again all came from group members as to what they would be comfortable working with and to share in this kind of intimate way. So honesty, empathy, vulnerability. We agreed to disagree, to respect each other, to be open, to be supportive, to be balanced, allowing for personal expression without targeting, because we knew people were going to think differently and we didn't want it to become personal. We wanted time and space for processing, especially if something came out that was emotional. And then my favorite one, which is the only one I ever remember, is follow the golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated. And I forgot to update the slide, but it's now the platinum rule, which is asking to treat others as they would like to be treated. And so we had 4 different focus areas. We focused on listening to each other, peer-to-peer communication, employee development, gaining support from leadership, because it's pretty vulnerable for interpreters to go out there and interpret controversial topics to an angry all around public. And then we also recognize our longstanding need in the Park Service to diversify the interpretive workforce. And so our first group was the peer-to-peer communications work group. And they focused on those listening conversations with each other. And then moving from peer-to-peer, we were then able to focus on our strategic plan. We also worked with our peers in visitor and resource protection, because we realize as representatives of the Park Service that they are out there dealing with many of these same types of issues and absorbing the heat from the public, especially with the impetus being George Floyd and policing. So our next work group was employee development. We wanted to create tools so that people were prepared to go out and provide this interpretation. And so this group focused on developing tools that would professionalize our interpretation of these issues. And the toolkit, which I know is something that came up, which is on an internal site. So we will talk more about what we've created for you guys to access those resources, was one of the primary things that we developed. And it just includes a cache of tools and resources for interpreting race and social justice. And then moving on to our pilot training. One thing we realized across the board is that the Park Service had been focused so strongly on dialogic interpretation. You guys are probably familiar with facilitated dialogue, where we ask groups these questions and we engage people in conversations where we hope it will deepen understanding and lead towards some kind of healing process. When people are that charged and that angry and that polarized, though, we thought this might not be great. A GS4 park guide going out there and inciting some rage, which we know is pent up all around when it comes to some of these issues. So we are working with a group, and that also includes Sarah Lyle, and she is still helping us out from her time at Arabia Mountain National Heritage Area. So she contributed to that group and that effort. In fact, will be our lead instructor. But we're developing a pilot on basic interpretation skills, and that's not what has been taught for a long time. But we thought we needed to dial it back and teach people just the basic messaging, the basic customer service, the basic do's and don'ts of giving an interpretive program, and try to help them have the tools for a range of menu options, because sometimes you might just need sort of a safe narrative program when you don't want things to get too intense. And also visitors really do enjoy learning through stories, which is something we were worried about losing. And we're going to be piloting that in March, and we've been working on with a team of just talented interpreters from the region. So we're excited about that. Next up is developing a coaching and mentoring network. A lot of people have asked for somebody that they can talk with about trying out a new story, or dealing with a difficult kind of audience, or just the strange questions people get. So we're working on a coaching and mentoring network. We put on a number of trainings, and then our next emphasis area is to diversify the interpretive workforce. And we're supporting recruitment and career development kind of under the umbrella of the region's strategic plan for recruitment, but specifically for interpreters. And we have members of the group planning to go out and support that work. So we will be at career fairs and different events encouraging people to apply for National Park Service positions from diverse communities, and also targeting historically Black universities. Leadership support, this one is such a biggie. It's our final focus area. But pretty much at every listening session that we did with our frontline interpreters, the number one request they made in terms of what they needed from management, from leadership at the regional office, was they wanted written support from agency leadership saying it is okay to go beyond enabling legislation, to tell the stories of all people. And I was really surprised that this was such a grave concern, because I felt like inclusive interpretation, reaching out, telling the stories of all people, that's right there in our management policies. It's in our Director's Order 6 for interpretation and education. It's in the Centennial Act. It's going to be a big focus of America 250. So it really is there. I'll even share some draft language with you all from the America 250 strategic plan that has not yet been issued, but this is the wording that will likely be coming out, saying that the United States history and its complexity, its discomfort must all be acknowledged and included in the commemorative events, programs, and other outcomes created for the 250th, and that history only becomes complex and controversial when we choose to deny or not acknowledge the pieces of it, and that it's this discomfort with talking about history and acknowledging the pain it's created that makes it difficult in the first place, not really just the fact of the existence of our difficult history. And having excluded facts from our national narrative is something we're recognizing and saying it's time to step up and acknowledge that. So the National Park Service is looking to acknowledge the full depth and breadth. But I looked deeper to understand where that fear came from interpreters, and we asked more questions. And what it boiled down to is that when visitors complain, which visitors will complain when they're surprised by a non-dominant narrative or a new perspective, that interpreter's career can be vulnerable and negatively impacted. And if you think about it, you can anticipate that if a stakeholder is surprised or visitor is surprised by new scholarship or new stories, that you'll hear from them. And it may not even be anything controversial. For example, in the state of Texas, they only updated the curriculum a couple of years ago to reflect that slavery is a primary cause of the Civil War. So something like our National Park Service sanctioned statement that slavery was the cause and catalyst of the Civil War, which was part of the 150th and the Civil War to Civil Rights commemoration, that could be a surprise to somebody and set somebody off. And so that was part of what people were dealing with. So we went about working towards getting some formal support. We drafted a memo, but you guys remember the landscape 2 summers ago. It wasn't the time for such a memo to get signed. But now things have changed under Secretary Howland and our new director Sams. There has been clear and consistent messaging of support and encouragement for this more inclusive interpretive approach. So that is encouraging, but we still are hearing that there's that sense of vulnerability about the reaction from visitors and peers when an interpreter goes out and surprises somebody with a story they've never heard before. So therefore, we actually held a big joint session with park managers, with superintendents, and also with interpretive managers from around the region. And we enlisted their support, asking them to go back to their parks and start the conversation about inclusive interpretation at the park level with their interpretive teams, and basically give them the message that we have your back. We also felt that this would avoid the types of surprises from management if something came up that was going to be a hot topic, and they could help assess how that would play out in park relations with visitors in the local community or even in the media. And so we really did want to have parks be lockstep in strategizing, managing the reactions when we really jump in and do tell these untold stories that we've never told before. We also asked them in responding to complaints to make space for the public to express their ideas and to respond with empathy, with respect, with that unbiased, truthful information, and then also add complete and credible citations. And really, I personally see doing that as an extension of our education tradition in the Park Service, is managing the public's response to what we are teaching. So the discussion went well. At the time, Pedro Ramos was acting regional director, and he not only expressed support, in fact, he gave everybody a charge for expanding our interpretive stories. And so we will be, now the acting regional director is Cash, recording a video giving permission and that charge and sharing it with all of our interpreters during our pilot interpretive training. When we're teaching them the basics from the get-go, we'll say, hey, go out and please do tell our stories. So that's kind of the different areas of the group. And so what I'll do now is I will transition to talking about sharing the resources and tools for with you guys that we developed in the toolkit. And Stephanie saved the day again. Not only is she responsible for my beautiful background, but she created a sheet which we've provided to Katie, so that will be shared with all of you, that will be a resource for accessing the different videos, the different trainings, the information, all of which is on sites that will be accessible from outside of the Park Service. So now, Katie, am I at time, or do we have time for some discussion?
We have plenty of time. We're doing
okay, wonderful. So I want to lead in before we just jump into questions. I'm going to ask you guys to support my ignorance about heritage areas by sharing the establishment year of of your heritage areas with me. Just throw out some random years, and that can be in the chat and read off, or you can just say it out so I hear this.
So as you guys are typing in your years that the heritage area was designated, or if you want to share while you're asking a question, don't be shy. If you want to raise your hand, or if you want to type something into the chat. Thank you, Christina. This was excellent to have all this background. Motor Cities was designated in 1998, and Upper Housatonic was in 2006. We often have kind of these, I often refer to them as the class of, because they come in as like groups.
How old is your oldest heritage area?
I should know this off the top of my head, but Illinois and Michigan is the oldest, and I'd say like 84, 85. Blackstone and Delaware and Lehigh are the next two, and Blackstone's 86.
All right, so it may not be as dramatic that we're dealing with, but things still have changed. So some of our parks are over 100 years old and such, but one of the misconceptions we deal with in interpretation is you've got to stick with the enabling legislation and the significance statements and what the current scholarship was at the time and why the area was designated in the first place. But I don't see it that way, the park enabling legislation, or for you guys, your own legislation. I see that as a kind of point in time at which the unit was established. But my interpretation is that we shouldn't be limited by that framework. They're a foundation that interpreters can use to explore the story and to learn the story, but to really go beyond and look at what changed in history since then, and what significant stories might have been omitted or suppressed at the time that the unit was established. Was LGBTQ a thing when the unit was established? In our case, Great Smoky Mountains, established in the 30s. It's all about the pioneers. There was no narrative about the Cherokee. If it was established today, what might have been included that's relevant? So that's my question when you look at the year of your heritage area, thinking about the legislation supporting it, and then thinking about how scholarship is changing around some of the key stories that you share and some of the groups that are relevant to your story. Are those portrayed, or are there areas where it might be time to take a fresher look? So,
well, I think one of the things with heritage areas is their legislation isn't always quite as detailed as a park. And it's that collaborative approach to management planning. But, for example, like Motor Cities talks about the labor history of the automobile industry. And that history is very diverse because of the workforce and the communities around Detroit and Flint and others. But I think, Lowell, did you have a hand up? Did you want to share something from Yuma National Heritage Area? I thought you did.
Let me just unmute. No, I didn't have my hand up, but I may have something to contribute here shortly.
Okay. And I think that evolution, even from some of the earlier management plans, that may just, for example, talking about coal, but when you talk about coal, you talk about the people. I mean, that's the thing with the Heritage Area program. It's always about how the communities and the people use the landscape. And oftentimes there are parks within the heritage areas, like the whole state of Tennessee has a lot of Civil War parks. So the park story evolves too, to be more inclusive. The heritage area is able to do that. And oftentimes I see heritage areas as leading the way with some of that fresher, if you will, interpretation or more dialogue. I know that's the case for Arabia Mountain. Stephanie, did you want to walk through the handout at all?
Sure, I can do that. Can you give me screen sharing?
I don't have to give you permission. You can just do it.
Okay.
It's at the bottom and green.
Bottom, that little green screen share that looks like the Teams one. I just had a dress rehearsal and learned it.
Got it. Okay, let me.
There you go.
So are you guys seeing a SharePoint site, basically?
Yes.
Okay, when I click to the Word document, are you seeing that as well? Did I share correctly? Okay.
Yes.
Great. So just a quick look, and to introduce myself, I'm Stephanie Metzler. I'm the exhibits and publication specialist for our region. And I was part of the work group, the Race and Social Justice work group. And like Christiana said, it was a multifaceted thing that the group came together to do. And this toolkit just became one outcome. And so it was a cluster of group members kind of just started pulling all these different resources that were out there. Just, hey, I found this website really interesting. I found this book really interesting. So it's not like an official NPS thing. All of it. It's just a lot of recommendations from your peers. There is on our SharePoint, we did link to a lot of NPS policy, and so there are internal things, but you can see there's just recommended reading, recommended websites, recommended videos. And that's what I created a document to share with you guys that follows with a lot of those recommendations. So you'll see these same headers are just the same pages that we have on our toolkit. So the SharePoint itself, I can't just give you the link because you guys fully know that we have our internal things and firewalls and permissions, and then in addition, a lot of the links go to other internal sites. So it was just really complicated in that way. And some things don't apply to you, like the Hatch Act. But these recommended sites, even things so this big button doesn't help, but on the document, there's all this reading and resources, different articles, different videos. So that's what this document follows along with. It's not a web of things, it's more linear, but again, these headings just follow right along with the toolkit pages. You get all these links, and I just omitted the internal ones that you wouldn't be able to access. And yeah, Katie will be sharing that out.
And I think the content is very relevant. You know, the SharePoint is a tool that the Park Service uses, you know, is more of another web platform. But Stephanie has put together the links to the documents that are really relevant. Because on the SharePoint site, like some of the things just link to another SharePoint site, but they might just be a YouTube link. So this is very comprehensive. And also colleagues in the Northeast region have done some other work that's on the Common Learning Portal, which is a site that we can provide access to. So if anyone wants access to those things on the Common Learning Portal, I can help to provide access to that. But the Common Learning Portal was also kind of another, like an internal social media, if you will. I think, would that be an accurate definition?
Sort of.
Yeah, in theory. And also
yeah.
very wonky because it was made by the government. But
yeah, like in the videos, it's a lot of third-party sites, just things that we thought were really great. But of course, there's a lot of TED Talks in there too. So that's like a whole subsection. So yeah, just sending you out, or like Christiana said, creating a cache. So it's not just the whole entire web. Here's a good starting point for your own personal growth, your professional growth.
Yeah, and again, this is pure curated stuff. This whole initiative was employee-driven, requested by employees. The inspiration and leadership comes from employees. We have coordinated it, but these are things that people found that they thought would be useful, that they've shared up. So as you're going through this, it's from interpreters for other interpreters saying, hey, this is helpful. You might be on mute, Katie.
all the different screens in the chat to see if there were any questions typed in there. But would anyone from a heritage area want to share how in this kind of time we've had some from other best practices where we talked about interpreting racial justice in your heritage areas or responding to current events? Specifically, we had something related to kind of Juneteenth, and then we've, broader concepts as well. But to Christina's point, has your story evolved over the time since you were created as a heritage area, or are your partners, I know there's a group from the Alliance of National Heritage Areas kind of addressing workforce and heritage area staffing to bring in more diversity onto staffs, but also diversity onto boards and other ways to expand that conversation and make sure that everyone in the community feels included and has a seat at the table. Does anyone want to talk about your efforts on trails or programs, or just evolution of your partnerships that you want to share, or does anyone have any specific questions?
Yeah, Katie, this is great. I'm glad to see this, and I chair for the Alliance, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and one of the things it's important that the idea of social justice and conversation around race has to be an inextricable part of this dialogue, if you will. And one of the things that we've done as a collective of heritage areas is to look at our role, and the 55 of us currently that are across the United States, as complete and accurate storytellers about all of history. It's not surprising to anybody on this call that it has been intentional withholding true history of this country. And we continue to see efforts to do just that. And if we're ever going to have a meaningful dialogue, we have to have all of the information on the table that ensures that everyone has an equal voice and belongs there to talk about solutions for bridging the racial divide that we see in this country and the embedded racism in every system that governs this fragile democracy that we live in. And so we just recently released a position paper. It's the first ever position paper that the Alliance has done on the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and have just completed a Spanish language version of that as well. That's just going through some finalization on that, but we'll be releasing that broadly next month. But, one of the things we're doing here in Yuma, where we have a large Hispanic population, when I first started here 4 years ago, there was no intentional outreach to that local community, and there was nothing in our state historic parks or in our wetlands areas that even talked to that, which I found unusual. And so we formed what was initially called a Hispanic Advisory Council and has now evolved into a regional advisory council to make sure that we were listening to the voice of the customer, if you will, that people are hearing things from the actual perspective of the protagonist. We are adding to our Colorado River State Historic Park an exhibit highlighting African-American farmers and ranchers. I had no idea there were black farmers here in Yuma. You never hear about it. And so we're going to deal with that. We are finally putting a new exhibit talking about the impact of the so-called Indian Wars here in this community, and worked in connection with the Quetzan tribe here in developing interpretive displays and to talk about that very issue and the whole idea around forced assimilation and everything else. And so, we have encouraged our colleagues around the country that we have to, in order to be honest brokers, look at ourselves as individual organizations and then look at ourselves as a collective. What are we doing? As you mentioned, Katie, in terms of board representation, senior leadership, and, who do we do business with? If we're dealing with vendors, are there vendors of color and all that we could be working with as well? So it's a huge thing, and I'm glad that Parks is involved in this conversation, in this discussion, because we certainly are ready to take it to another level here in this coming year once this whole issue of reauthorization gets taken care of for the majority of us. So thank you to the presenters here, and we would certainly welcome you if you want to attend any of our DEI committee meetings. It's open to people beyond just the Alliance. If you want to come in and do a presentation or just to hear and see how you can collaborate, shoot me a note in the chat with your contact information, and we'll put you on the list for those things. So keep on keeping on, y'all.
That's wonderful. Thanks for that. And yeah, I will drop my email. I think I figured out how to use your Zoom chat right into the chat, but that's inspiring. Thank you. One thing that I realized is if you're sitting here saying, yeah, we've pretty much got it, nothing's changed, is blind spots. So I mentioned we worked on this permissions video, and I wrote the storyboard giving interpreters a charge to include the stories of all people. And we mentioned, don't get stuck in lost cause narrative, the story of enslavement, Native Americans. And working on our training pilot, we have 2 advisors who are professors in interpretation, and it came back and said, what about LGBTQ? Are there any stories? I don't know of any. Of course there are, but I don't know of any. So that kind of hit me that that could be a big blind spot, looking at just the more recent time frame that those stories and those rights have been elevated in national conscience in a stronger way, and the timeline of when our parks were established and when we told the stories we tell, and that there isn't one big story that comes to mind that doesn't mean there aren't any. I definitely realize, oh, that's about me. So sometimes it's asking the question, like, not even whose story do I know of that we're not telling, but is there a group of people who might be significant to my site's story that we never even thought about?
Well, that's what I think. I was looking to see who's here, and I don't see anyone from Niagara Falls today, but they have a great cultural center on the Underground Railroad. And the point of having it as a cultural center and not just a museum is that meant to be a gathering place. And it's in a historic customs house that's now attached to an international train station. So hopefully getting people who are traveling internationally between Canada and the United States, but also there as a tool for the community. And I think, with the example of the Underground Railroad, because they weren't trying to tell their story, because they would get in trouble if they told their story. So in their own time, they were hiding the tools that they used and the message and who was involved, because that wouldn't have been popular to say, like, oh yeah, I help everybody get over, and oh yeah, come to my hotel and I'll steal your slaves. There wasn't a story that was being told, but and I'm using the word steal meaning, because they were helping people. But as people were coming to see Niagara Falls, the geological location, that became a place to escape the one more river to cross into Canada. And, telling that story now is very, it's always been relevant, but they had to kind of uncover those stories and who were the heroes and the conductors there. And I think the Erie Canal has a lot of historic sites now that celebrate those stories. So some of that is kind of uncovering the hidden traditions and stories in communities. Or, now at the African American Museum here in Washington, that also is about culture and how it's not just the past, but it's going forward with, Gullah Geechee as a cultural heritage area. Because those traditions continue. The Native American Museum in Washington, D.C. is about the living traditions, not, putting something on a shelf, but who are the artists, who are the folks telling those stories and sharing traditions and evolving traditions, that traditions aren't static. But it was great. I was looking to see if anyone from Mississippi was here, but Mississippi Delta organized a tour for all the heritage areas when they were in town, I guess 5-ish years ago, to showcase some of the stories and artwork that are in the African American Smithsonian Museum here in Washington that relate back to the Mississippi Delta. So there's so many stories, and it's wonderful to give that space for interpreters and communities to really dig deeper. Are there others who want to share or ask questions? We're usually not such a shy group.
Maybe we just dump too much data. Hi, Brian.
Hey there. I wanted to share, I guess, and maybe inspire people in that whole idea of thinking outside of your normal sort of framework and outside of your box. So the Motor Cities Heritage Area here in Southeast Central Michigan focuses on the automotive and labor industry and its history. And so the crossover into the social justice conversation comes through the unions, and the labor movement that inspired a lot of that sort of work. And so we found that there are moments where we see that crossover, and it just became really apparent. We posted an article last week about the connection between Dr. Martin Luther King's March to Freedom in Detroit that happened in June of '63, right before he went to DC, with the more famous march, and delivered an early version of the I Have a Dream speech. But that was spurred by an invitation from union leadership here in Detroit that brought him there and marched with him on the front line. So I just think about these stories, like you said, that you can tell by sort of turning over the rock and sort of looking to that next page of the story. There's a headline there, but then what's sort of below that, and finding out that the UAW union leadership was behind Dr. King coming here and delivering the first version of the speech, inspired us to write that article. Got a great pickup, and still very much weaves into the story of Motor Cities, but it also, obviously talks about social justice. And I can go on about the role that the unions have played in that. So we certainly take this as ammunition to continue to move forward on exploring more and more of those sorts of stories.
That's awesome and inspiring. Thank you. One thing about finding those stories in the Southeast is sometimes I'm starting to realize the more I go and work with parks, sometimes they're hidden in certain places. Like some of the rural areas, it might still be fear of retaliation for a civil rights involvement past, that people are living side by side, perpetrators of racial violence, civil rights activists who at the time kept that secret, and they don't know if hearts and minds of neighbors have changed. Is it still unsafe? Do you still have to keep this engagement with the civil rights movement a family secret? People aren't walking around with T-shirts. So I know sometimes things are still hidden because it's unclear if things have really changed with the people around them and to what extent, and is it safe yet in communities. And a great family story of involvement might have been a family secret for generations, but is this generation the story that can tell it, or do they still need to be careful? So just a lot of dynamics that we've found, especially with some of the rural areas, as we've gone out to try to find those stories that are more hidden.
Yeah, that was kind of my point with the Underground Railroad, that maybe people may not have shared their stories or the civil rights movement anytime in history where they were doing something that was deemed risky behavior.
And then on the flip side, for descendants, shame of what their ancestors perpetrated, and not wanting to have their family remembered that way. So that's something that's come up as well.
Brian, I shared the link to the website that you mentioned. So that's in the chat for folks. Yeah, I think these tools can be really beneficial to all of the heritage areas and their partners. And we'll certainly share that out with the recording of the session. I think it really is important that, as we know with heritage areas, that these local stories are told. Like I see that there's staff from the Baltimore National Heritage Area on the call, and there's so many interesting NAACP stories, and Thurgood Marshall being from Baltimore. And sometimes it is kind of, as Brian said, that the Washington March that gets all the attention and takes up all the air in a room, but there's so many other things. It wasn't like that march just happened out of nowhere, like the stories that lead to these big important moments and Supreme Court cases and things. But it's what happens at that point that gets all the attention, and not what got you there. And so all the stories are so relevant and important, and they're not just local stories, they're national stories, but sometimes they don't get the attention, is my point.
Yeah, or maybe there's a local connection, like you're saying, to those national stories, because there's often the misconception that these events just happened, and the level of strategy, the planning, the blueprint isn't a part of that story, and that is often a local grassroots story.
Right. The civil rights movement just didn't happen in 1960. There's so much work that happened leading up to that the moments that, and that's kind of Jalil's point, that in the history book, there might be this story, but not what's important, what's buried beneath.
Yeah.
So, anyone else have questions or want to share?
Oh, I don't know if Van is still on, but I just want to say that the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area had some pretty significant actions happen over the last year. They really, I think they're showing that the civil rights struggle is not over. I think some of the ways that they have done that is in how, all the Civil War statues are still up, and how do you deal with that history? And they actually work with the town of Franklin, and really looking at how they confronted that history. And I think I don't want to share their story, because, to be quite honest, listening to Van and Laura share it is very, very powerful. But just if you know, I think it's the Nashville Citizen of the Year, or maybe the Tennessee Citizen of the Year, was actually given to partners of the Tennessee Civil War Heritage Area for their work in telling the stories of the African American soldiers and still putting it in context. And I think that is a really important part of what all of our heritage areas do. It's not only telling the stories, but put it in context with the history that has already been shared and told, so that that dominant narrative that has been around for so long, we can understand how it is impacted by this new information and make sure it's in context. Because I think some of the struggles that people have is well, then this history is not the same. And it's right, it's not the same, but it's got to be that we understand how it was all happening together. I mean, I'm sure in 50 years, if somebody's writing the history of today, you're going to have different narratives. And how does that all come together to really form a complete story?
And revisionist history isn't a bad thing. We ask different questions today about the same events than we did in the past.
Okay, Elisa, I'll take your bait and talk just a bit. The Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area began with its tagline being telling the whole story of America's greatest challenge. And 20 years ago, the Civil War community largely derided that because, oh, that's not the story of the Civil War. We stuck to it, and 20 years later, yeah, it's pretty remarkable, the changes. In 2005, we hosted all of the heritage areas for what the Alliance used to have annual conferences, and we hosted that in Nashville. And, some of the events were Diane Nash speaking at Fisk University before a packed house, including the governor of Tennessee, who was smart enough to know that the featured speaker was not him, but Diane Nash. She had been a student there.
Can I help you?
She had been a student there, and that was a pretty, I think, very transformative moment for a lot of people who attended. More recently, we hosted the Slave Dwelling Project Conference.
Nice.
And that featured a very different type of keynote by Colson Whitehead, talking about the Underground Railroad and why and what it meant. His famous novel that is now the movie. But those are big events. What we really like to do is to work with communities. So to speak with, to Elisa's point, just last week, we met with a group of African Americans in Winchester, Tennessee, a place that was pretty oppressive during the Civil War and up until recent times. But we've been working with them patiently for 13 years to save a historic Rosenwald school and to turn that into a heritage center. And it's named for a USCT soldier who came back to his community and then became the educator of that community. So the first phase is over, and they had thought about it, and they sort of knocked me over with their second phase. Well, we want to tell the whole story of the USCT veterans who came from this area. What did they do? Did they go and fight in the Buffalo Wars? Did they fight in, what happened to them? We think we can find this out. We know people. Let's start down that road. And that's typically our approach. We want to hear, we work for communities. We don't work with them as much as we work for them. We want to find out what they want to do, and then we try our damnedest to implement it and to make sure that they have the product and the project or whatever it is they want to do. So, this going down this road that y'all have been talking about is totally worthwhile. And I would just say, Tennessee's a pretty conservative state. I think that goes without saying. But, outside of taking down some of the monuments, which did lead to death threats, and I did have to have a police escort at one point, it's very worthwhile, and it's a very important thing to do.
That's amazing. Thank you. Yeah, monuments are another hot issue all over the Park Service. Typically, not removing them, but adding context. And we actually got a really neat call for a potential new monument because it was at a battlefield, and there were monuments to the different United States troops that were there, but there was the Native American soldiers were not honored with a monument. So the group was saying, hey, context isn't enough. Everybody who fought and died here needs a monument. So that was a first for a new monument.
Yeah, telling these stories is so important. And as I said, like making sure the right communities are at the table now, or all communities, not the right communities. But that this interpretation, the signage, the monuments. Carol, thank you or Van, thank you so much for sharing. And I'd love to continue this conversation. We do have more time if anyone else has questions for the speakers or wants to share how your areas telling stories or transitioned stories. It's really good to have a dialogue among your peers.
Is anyone dealing with public backlash for a story that you've introduced or requests for a story that you're not yet telling?
And Elisa shared some more links in the chat too. So if folks want to share that way, it's another option. I mean, one way too, Lowell was sharing about diversification of boards. Has anyone seen kind of as you brought more partners to the table or more people to your board, how things have changed? And Alex, did you want to share?
Yeah, this is a little more about kind of which stories you emphasize, but I'm from the Maritime Washington National Heritage Area, so we're working on our management plan right now. And a big part of that has been putting together kind of a historical context statement, like what is the big story that we're looking at. And we made a really conscious decision at the beginning to focus, to really center Native American stories whenever possible. And we had a working group with with many of the tribes kind of helping us do that. And we've gotten some pushback as we've published it about, well, why are you centering these stories instead of military, say? Like we get comments like, well, I was expecting to see more of this. Like, why aren't you talking more about this? So I think it's even, you get down to like the number of words you dedicate to each perspective becomes political in a way, which is, I mean, I guess I don't have to explain that to you guys, but yeah, what you focus on really is talking about your priorities. And we've definitely gotten pushback on that.
Yeah. No, I mean, people aren't used to sharing the spotlight or the hero narrative for their story. That is not fun.
For sure.
That's good.
Thank you, Alex. And Christina, you were asking the age of heritage areas. Alex is from one of our newer heritage areas designated in the Dingle Act in 2019.
Oh, exciting. So you're shaping the narrative as we speak.
Yeah. Yep, we're the newest cohort here.
That's awesome.
Anyone else want to share? Just jump right in.
Anyone hearing reports from your frontline staff that visitor interactions have gotten challenging to tell the stories that they're telling since our national temperature heated up so much in the last couple of years? Is anyone getting requests for support or guidance from your frontline interpretive staff?
I think, Van, as you shared, it can be personally, people can personally intimidate you and threaten. And so it can, as Christina said, that rangers can feel threatened, executive directors can feel threatened. You know, you're at people who are at universities feeling like their jobs could be threatened if they aren't sharing in a way that, whether it's the governor or those in power want things shared. So I think I want to thank everyone for all the work that you do to bring forth stories that may be untold. And I think Christina and Stephanie, the work that you're doing to lead interpretation in the Park Service is super important. And making that space for people to feel comfortable to share is very relevant too, and just important. The work that your team did and the work that you're doing with other regions, as I mentioned, Northeast region has been having this kind of dialogues. I mean, we all are, but I want to thank you specifically in the Southeast region for the work that you're doing. And thank you, Christina, today for your time, and Stephanie for putting together this really great resource for heritage areas, that we don't have to just deal with the firewall and permissions and things, but putting this together specifically for our community and to be shared with heritage area partners. I want to thank you so much for that. Any other closing thoughts or questions before we head out?
Well, thank you all so much. And I hear every day almost about the inspiring work that's being done in heritage areas and the stories you tell through Elisa. So congratulations on collectively helping us tell a forward-thinking, inclusive national story. It's been really fun to talk with you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.